Hey, what's up everybody? It's Lids, and the English Premier League starts tomorrow, so I'm going to give you some tips for your EPL fantasy team. Both a simple solution and some in-depth analysis for those who want more nuance and detail. We're playing the main fantasy format on the official EPL site, which means we have £100 million to create the best team possible, and the better the player, the more expensive they are to select. Starting with the quick and simple team, this is what I recommend going with if you want to set a team at the beginning of the year and not worry too much about making changes from one week to the next. You'll get some really big players like Erling Haaland up top and Mo Salah in the midfield, both of which are safe bets to score you a ton of points. Make those two your captains. Then we can still afford some big names in the back like Trent Alexander-Arnold, Ben White, and Gvardiol, all of whom are on very good defensive teams and also have some attacking potential. Then for goalkeeper, we have Jordan Pickford, a good enough player that you can feel confident leaving him in just about every week. Then we round out the team with some good value midfielders like Leon Bailey, Alejandro Garnacho, and Christopher Nkunku, who may not be superstars, but they're all quite good. Then a similar story with Cunha and Joao Pedro up top. So basically, you play those guys every week, so this team gives you the biggest names possible with as little thinking as possible. The big compromise you're making is that your bench is really weak, but if you're almost never going to swap in your bench players, then that's kind of the whole point. However, for those who are looking to more actively manage their team, including making substitutions and transfers based on form and matchups, I recommend something a little more balanced like this, which is the actual team that I plan to use, with some potential last-minute changes. The overarching idea this time round is that we are deliberately skipping Haaland and Salah because although they are both amazing, they are both incredibly expensive. So this team spreads our budget around more across the different players and positions, giving us more flexibility to adjust our team at the cost of maybe missing out on one or two of the best players in the league. First, in goal we have the combination of Mark Flecken from Brentford and Areola from West Ham, both of whom cost $4.5 million, which is just about the standard price for a starting goalkeeper. And basically, that's all we're looking for here. Two solid keepers that we can switch between depending on the matchup, because I prefer taking that approach to having one more expensive $5 million keeper who you play in every match, regardless of matchup, and one $4 million keeper who just sits on your bench doing nothing. So overall, I don't read too much into the goalkeeper position because I think a lot of it comes down to personal preference. But in the end, it probably doesn't make that much of a difference. In the back, however, things get a lot more interesting, because by not taking Haaland and Salah, we save enough money that we can still afford Trent, Gvardiol, and either Gabriel or Saliba, giving us three really solid defenders that are good enough both offensively and defensively, in Trent's case because of his teammates, even in difficult matchups. We'll talk more about potential alternatives in a little bit, but we're generally assuming we're going to play with three defenders in our lineup. The remaining two players are Barco, who is not usually a starter for Brighton, but looks to be filling in at left back, at least for the first month or so until Estupiñán comes back from injury. That means you're getting a starting defender who may have some offensive potential on a mid-table team for about a £500,000 to £1 million discount. Then we have Harward Bellis, also at $4 million, but in this case, assuming Southampton does not have a miraculous underdog season, he's mostly just here to sit on your bench, and maybe, since a lot of people are selecting him, his value will go up a little bit over time. Then by skipping Haaland and Salah, we also benefit a lot in the midfield. Cole Palmer is our most expensive player, and he was the highest scoring player last season, though he's still coming at £2 million less than Salah. I'm not necessarily convinced he's going to have quite as good a season this year as he did last year, but he should still be the centerpiece of Chelsea's attack, and even if Chelsea is an absolute mess this year, he's probably the only player you can have confidence will still have a good season, barring injury. Though again, we'll talk about some alternatives later. But we still have a lot of budget to spare, so we can go big on one of Manchester City's midfielders. Now, I went back and forth between Phil Foden and Kevin De Bruyne, both of whom cost $9.5 million, so you can take whoever you prefer. After some talk of Foden maybe playing less in the first week or two after coming back late from the Euros, at least in the short term, I'm going to go with De Bruyne, after which I might switch back to Foden. De Bruyne is also on a lot fewer teams, which is a good thing if you're trying to differentiate yourself from your opponents, though that may may mean that Foden goes up in price before De Bruyne, making it a little more tricky to switch between the two of them if that's something you're also thinking about doing. Then we still have enough budget to go big on Odegaard, another midfielder capable of scoring tons of points for us, so you could make any of these three guys your captain, depending on form, matchups, and your personal preference. We couldn't quite afford Bukayo Saka, but I don't think there should be that big of a drop-off from Saka to Odegaard, and we save 1.5 million in the process. That means for our fourth midfielder, we can still afford Anthony Gordon at 7.5 million. He had a great season last year, and Newcastle starts the year with several good fixtures, so I expect Gordon to get off to a quick start, though as we'll discuss soon, there are many good options in and around this price range. And because we have four really solid midfielders, we should be fine having Harry Winks be our fifth and final midfielder, and mostly just have him sit on the bench. Now up top we have Dominic Solanke, Darwin Nunez, and Alexander Isak. Isak is the obvious choice after scoring over 20 goals last year. Despite being injured for a bit of the season, he gives you really good value at 8.5 million. Good enough that he's another option as one of your captains. Then Solanke at 7.5 million is an absolute no-brainer, especially now that he's moved to Spurs, because he was scoring consistently on Bournemouth, and no offense to Bournemouth, but assuming that he plays consistently now at Tottenham, you'd expect him now to get more goal-scoring opportunities. So make sure that Richarlison doesn't take too much time away from him, but if Solanke is playing most of the minutes, then I'd expect him to have possibly his best year yet. Then lastly, we have Nunez at 7.5 million, and for him, there is an asterisk. Because over the course of the entire season, I do not expect him to be the best choice at this price range. However, of the various teams likely to be at the top of the table, Liverpool has what is most likely the best set of fixtures for the first portion of the season. So I'm expecting Liverpool to score a bunch of goals, but the question is who is going to get those goal contributions. And though Nunez hasn't always been the best at converting his opportunities, I think he'll still get enough quality chances in the first portion of the season to start him on the team, and then transfer someone in to take his place once the fixtures start to get tougher. So this is my baseline, but as I said, there are many alternatives to consider, either from the onset or as potential early to mid-season transfer targets. So I'm going to quickly flip through each of the teams to show you which players I have my eye on and why. Starting with Arsenal, the obvious place is the defenders because Arsenal conceded the fewest goals last year, so anyone between White, Saliba, and Gabriel are certainly very safe options. There is even a case to be made for taking two of them, however, I'm generally not the biggest fan of doubling up, at least in defense, because there's always the chance of having a bad matchup, conceding a bunch of goals, and having two defenders get a really bad score in the same week. Though these guys were so good last year that in this case, you might be able to make an exception. There is, however, one other player who really intrigues me. The sneaky selection for Arsenal is Calafiori, a recent acquisition. This will be his first year playing in the EPL, so he's a little bit of an unknown, but had a lot of success in Serie A, and from what I hear, like Ben White, also gets more involved offensively, and so assuming that he's consistently the fourth member of Arsenal's back line, could give you similar value to Ben White, but at a $500,000 discount. I do plan on swapping Saliba for Calafiori. I just want to see Calafiori play for a week or two before I do that, so for the time being, I'm playing it safe with Saliba. Then, as I said before, in many ways I see Saka as a more expensive alternative to Odegaard. Yes, he might score a little bit more, but I think being able to invest that 1.5 million that we save by going with Odegaard is worthwhile. Then there are a lot of good options at 6.5 million, so if you're trying to cut costs a little bit, Declan Rice is worth considering. I know he's generally a more defensive midfielder, but he scored 7 goals and got 9 assists last year, which is quite a bit, and from the Arsenal matches I watched, that did not seem like a fluke. So I think Rice is a very safe 6.5 million option. Then Trossard and Martinelli, both of them potentially have higher upside, but in both cases I'm a little concerned about playing time, since they're kind of competing against one another, so unless one clearly establishes themselves over the other, I'm gonna stay away. Then I was a little surprised to see just how many goal contributions Kai Havertz had last season, but Arsenal has so many good players at other positions that he still would not be my first, second, or even third choice. Next, we have Aston Villa, and starting, of course, with the goalkeeper, Emi Martinez. You could use him. He is 5 million, so he's a little bit more on the expensive side, but he is a good enough keeper that you could keep him in regardless of matchup, and then maybe going with just a 4 million bench option so that you aren't spending too much on this position. Then in the midfield, I really like Leon Bailey at 6.5 million because he scored 10 goals and had 11 assists last year despite not playing as much as he probably deserved to play. So assuming that he does get more time this year, then he could be giving you a lot of points even at his relatively modest price. Morgan Rogers has gotten some attention because, although he's listed as a midfielder, he spent some time in the preseason at forward. That obviously means he has a little more goal-scoring potential, and at just 5 million, he'd be very inexpensive, but I'm not sure how sustainable that arrangement is. So he could be worth using as one of your last midfielders, and if he is playing consistently and playing well, then you get great value, and if not, then as an inexpensive player, you don't feel too bad about sticking him on your bench. Then the big forward for Villa is of course Ollie Watkins, who had an incredible season last year, and not that it came completely out of nowhere, he has had some decent seasons in the past, but I do think that Watkins and Villa overall overperformed last year and are likely to regress a little bit back to the mean this season. So while I'm sure Watkins will still be very good, that I'm not convinced that he's going to give you significantly more points than other players who cost a little bit less. Then with Bournemouth, of course, Solanke until very recently was the star of the show, but what with him moving to Tottenham, I don't really have anyone in particular that I'm eyeing here. Then for Brentford, of course, we have Flecken as our goalie already, and Brian Mbeumo has decent potential at 7 million, although there are so many solid players at 6.5 million that I'm not necessarily sure he's going to outperform them, but you wouldn't be crazy for taking him there. The big player to keep an eye on, though, is of course Ivan Toney, who seems underpriced at 7.5 million, probably in large part because he was suspended for much of last season, but with a full season this year, I'm not sure anyone else is going to outperform him at this cost. He is very likely the person I will use to replace Nunez, because, at least to start the season, they cost the same amount, and it probably would be a safer choice to just start with Toney, and I may ultimately end up doing that, but as of right now, I'm taking a calculated risk to go with Liverpool in the form of Nunez. There is some talk of some bigger teams trying to acquire Toney, at least at the time of my recording, and if he does go to a big team that can set him up with more goal-scoring opportunities while at the same time not already having a forward who might compete with Toney for playing time, then that could further increase Toney's value and, much like Solanke, make him practically a must-use player. Then for Brighton, as I said, at least while Estupiñán is out for the first few weeks of the season, we're going to go with Barco. And if Matoma stays healthy, then he is another player at 6.5 million who has a lot of scoring potential. But he's working his way back from injury right now, so it's probably worth waiting a few weeks to see how he's doing before you add him. And at forward, Joao Pedro is just 5.5 million, and assuming he is the primary forward, then he could be a great low-cost option as your third forward. Then there's Chelsea, and they have, 50 players on their team? And as I was alluding to before, it's really hard to say with any confidence who is going to consistently play and in a role in which they can succeed outside of Cole Palmer. Chelsea conceded a lot of goals last season, and I'm not convinced that they're going to be much better defensively this year, but if you do want to take that risk, Reece James, when back from suspension and when healthy, which is a huge asterisk for him, does have a lot of offensive potential, so even if Chelsea concedes a lot of goals, he could still be a solid option at 5 million. But that's still tough to say because Malo Gusto had a really good season last year filling in for him, at least when healthy, but then once Reece James comes back from suspension, what happens? Because you could move Gusto to left back, but Cucurella, despite his relatively weak start for Chelsea, did finish last season very strong and had a good Euro, so then you'd likely be taking away from his playing time. So if one of those three clearly establishes themselves as someone who is going to regularly play, all of them have potential to give you goal contributions, and you're crossing your fingers that Chelsea figures it out defensively. In the midfield, all of the more attacking roles are extremely crowded. Outside of Palmer, Nkunku probably has the best chance of getting enough playing time and being in an advanced enough position to get goal and assist opportunities. But even then, I'm still hesitant to commit to him, at least until I've seen how Chelsea's new manager structures the lineup for the first few weeks. But in the best case scenario, Nkunku has a lot of potential for a 6.5 million player. So much so that if you were really bold, you could even consider swapping him in for Cole Palmer and using the 4 million that you saved to make big upgrades elsewhere. Then at forward, there's Nicholas Jackson for 7.5 million, who, despite much criticism last year, did still score a decent number of goals, and he is still quite young, so he could have room to improve. But between having Ivan Toney as another 7.5 million alternative, and ongoing talks of Chelsea still looking to bring in a new forward who would likely start in place of Jackson, I would be very cautious here. For Crystal Palace, at 4.5 million in defense, we have Anderson, who is really solid. Not gonna score you a bunch of goals or get a bunch of assists, but assuming Palace is decent defensively, he's a very safe pick. Then there's Eze at 7 million, who has gotten a lot of talk because of how well he finished the previous season. However, I think that a lot of that came from Olise creating lots of opportunities, but this year, Olise is gone. So while I'm sure Eze will still have a good season, I'm not sure it's going to be as good as some people are expecting it to be. And as we've said before, there are so many good options at 6.5 million that paying $500,000 more for Eze makes me a little more hesitant. Then similarly for Mateta, he scored a lot of goals last season, but also I think a lot of that came from the help of Olise, and with no Olise, I don't think he's going to have as good of a season this year. So at 7.5 million, I think you probably have better options. Then for Everton, you have Pickford at 5 million, a little bit more expensive, but he was very good last year, and Everton have generally been a strong defensive team, so certainly a solid choice this year as well, and you could probably have him be your go-to keeper every week and drop down to 4 million for a keeper that you keep on your bench. That also means that defense is a good place to look for Everton, and Mykolenko has potential to benefit both from Everton's relatively strong defense, while still being a more attacking-minded player. And at 4.5 million, this is another solid option you can choose without breaking the metaphorical bank. For Fulham, you could use Leno as your main keeper, again at 5 million. A little expensive if you're going to keep two relatively high-quality keepers, so maybe you have your second one be on the cheaper side. At forward, you have Muniz, who scored 9 goals in his relatively limited time last year, so assuming that he stays healthy for much of the season, at 6 million, he's another solid budget option in what would likely be your third forward slot. Then for Ipswich, I'm gonna plead ignorance here, but as is often the case for promoted sides, worth seeing if there are any inexpensive players who start doing surprisingly well, in which case, at the very least, you can save some budget by stashing one of those players deep on your bench. Much the same story here for Leicester. Wout Faes in defense could be a decent option here at just 4 million, but of course, Leicester may end up conceding a lot of goals, so you probably still shouldn't set your expectations too high. Then we have Liverpool, and there's Alisson for goalkeeper. He is pretty expensive at 5.5 million, so if you did want to have a full-time keeper, he certainly would be an option. In the back, obviously there's Trent, who we've already talked about. There's Van Dijk, who's an amazing defensive player, but he usually isn't as involved offensively, so he probably does not have as much high-end potential as some of the other big-name defenders, though he's certainly a very safe option. Then in the midfield, it gets kinda tricky because it gets kinda crowded. Obviously, there's Salah. He's amazing, but he's exorbitantly expensive. But once you go from there, between Luis Diaz, Diogo Jota, McAllister, Szoboszlai, and maybe even to a certain extent Elliott, you have a lot of players competing for only so many slots in the midfield, especially if you factor in that occasionally Gakpo will get moved into the midfield as well. So while all of those players certainly have the talent to provide a lot of points, the main question is, how is the Liverpool lineup going to look? And with a new manager this season, that makes it a little bit harder to say. However, as I was saying earlier, because you have a series of good fixtures early on, it may be worth taking your chances on some Liverpool players that you might not otherwise have added to your team just to benefit from what is likely to be a strong start to the season. One would assume most of those goals and assists will be coming through Salah, but after that, Jota at 7.5 million could certainly score a few goals, as could Nunez up top. But keep an eye out for Szoboszlai, because though he didn't play that much last season, he looked really good when he did. So if he is consistently getting good playing time, I think he could have a breakout season, making him another one of those potential 6.5 million value midfielders. Then you have Man City, and of course, lots of big players here. But remember, you can only have up to 3 on one team, and in some cases, City's depth can make it difficult to choose. City was the second best defensive team last year, and is likely to be in and around there this year as well, so I would put a pretty high priority on getting one of the City defenders, but since playing time does get split quite a bit between them, I went with Gvardiol because I think he has more offensive potential than all the others. Then in the midfield, of course, we already spoke about De Bruyne and Foden, and at least after the first match or two, I might prefer Foden to De Bruyne, though if you skip Salah and Haaland, you might have enough budget to get both of them. Rodri is a deceptively solid choice at 6.5 million, because you know if he's healthy, he's going to play. Granted, he's another player who might sit out after coming back late from the Euro. He does play in a more defensive role, which might make you think he doesn't get that many scoring opportunities, but with 8 goals and 10 assists last year, I think it's really easy to overlook how good of an offensive player Rodri is as well. And that makes him another midfielder with good potential at 6.5 million, and similarly to Declan Rice, is probably one of the safer picks there, but may not have quite as much upside as some of the other alternatives. Then of course there's Haaland, but we've talked about him as well. Then there's Man United, which I think is a somewhat tricky one to read. You could go with Onana as your main keeper at 5 million. I know he got a lot of criticism last year, but he actually had a decent season, at least from a fantasy perspective. And while not one of the absolute best defensive teams last year, Man U were still pretty solid in that regard. The big person to keep an eye on here is another member of our 6.5 million midfield club, Garnacho, who might not be as consistent as some of the other 6.5 million options we've discussed, but if he continues to improve, then he could be one of the higher risk, higher reward options in this price range. Then Newcastle is a team that I have high expectations for this season, and although they weren't great defensively last year, the year before that, they were very good defensively. So if you combine the low goals conceded with the goal contribution potential, then Trippier could be one of the best point-scoring defenders. And if you find yourself loading up on Arsenal defenders, but want to get a little more diversity in your back line, then Trippier could be a good way to do that. But if you're looking for a more middle-of-the-road defender, then Dan Burn at 4.5 million as someone who may not have the offensive potential of Trippier, but would still be a solid choice if Newcastle go back to their strong defensive ways. Then in the midfield, obviously, we already took Gordon, though because he's 7.5 million, you could consider dropping him for one of the many 6.5 million options. And add one more to the list with Guimaraes, because he's another solid option to consider at this price. The under-the-radar pick in the midfield, though, is Tonali. He was suspended for much of last season, and starts this season suspended, but in the limited time that he did play last year, he looked like he had a lot of potential. Obviously, you won't want to start the season with him, but once he does come back, assuming that he still gets good playing time, once he's had some time to reacquaint himself with the team, he could be worth considering, and at 5.5 million, he'd be very inexpensive. Then obviously up top, we've already talked about Isak. Then for Forest, this is where I've alluded to many times before how if you have one expensive keeper, maybe you want to have your second keeper be someone who is very inexpensive and just sits on your bench for much of the season. And Matt Turner seems to be the go-to for many people when it comes to £4 million keepers, because it is really hard to get a keeper for £4 million who actually plays, and while Forest did just purchase a new keeper this offseason, Turner played enough last year that maybe he's still your best bet for a minimum cost keeper. Outside of that, in the midfield, you could consider Morgan Gibbs-White as a relatively inexpensive option. Once again, the magic number is 6.5 million. Given how many other options you have there, including some safer picks like Rice and Rodri, and some higher potential picks like Bailey and Garnacho, Gibbs-White probably wouldn't be my choice, but you wouldn't be crazy for taking him. Then for Southampton, it's another opportunity to pick up a few lower cost players if you're really in need of sticking someone at the end of your bench, like I did with Harwood Bellis, but otherwise, no obvious people to watch out for here. Then there's Spurs, and for them, starting in the defense, We have Pedro Porro, who at 5.5 million is in an interesting price range, a little bit less than most of those other premium defenders, but has the potential to give you similar value there. So if you need to cut costs slightly, swapping him in for one of those big names could be a way to do it. In the midfield, the obvious choice is Son, but at 10 million, he is very expensive. He's been very consistent over the past several years, so while he's a little more expensive than some similar quality players, he may be a bit of a safer pick for that reason. Then, as I said before, after acquiring Solanke, I think he is a very good choice up top. Then for West Ham, obviously, we're taking their keeper, but maybe the biggest player to talk about for them is Jarrod Bowen, who had a really good season last year, and while it's tempting to say that was his first really good year, and therefore making it hard to say if he can repeat that, he had a similarly productive season a couple years ago, not quite as many goals, but significantly more assists, so it's not like last year came out of nowhere, which suggests it should theoretically be possible for Bowen to repeat a season like that. However, overall, I think West Ham was one of the other teams that overperformed the most last season, so if they do regress a bit this year, then Bowen's numbers may go down a bit as well. 7.5 million isn't a crazy price, but I give the slight edge to Anthony Gordon there, and as we've said many times before, there are so many options at 6.5 million that there's a pretty good chance that at least one of those players that costs a little less is going to outperform Bowen. Then the other player to note is Füllkrug, who West Ham just recently added from Dortmund. It will be his first year in the EPL, which raises some questions about how his game will translate into a new league, but after having success in one of the other biggest leagues in Europe, and presumably becoming one of the focal points of West Ham's attack, it's definitely worth keeping an eye on him. Then lastly, we have Wolves. And maybe I just watched a bunch of Wolves games last season, but I feel like they have a bunch of underrated players. Now, I'm not sure how good Wolves are going to be defensively, but as long as they don't concede too many goals, then I think Aït-Nouri has really good potential offensively, because there are many times when he looks like a wing, and a dangerous one at that. So I would wait a little bit to see just how Wolves are doing, especially since they play Arsenal and Chelsea week 1 and week 2. But Aït-Nouri might have enough goal contributions to be a solid choice, even if Wolves concede a fair number of goals. In the midfield, I really like Hwang, because despite having some injuries last season, he still scored 12 goals. So when healthy, he scores at a very good rate. Unfortunately, he just always seems to get injured. He's also a 6.5 million midfielder, and in this case, I'd consider swapping him in for a little bit if one of your midfielders from a similar price range is underperforming, with the understanding that you will eventually need to swap him back out once he inevitably gets injured. Then similarly, I think Cunha is also an underrated goal scorer and one who still has room to improve. And at 6.5 million in the forward spot, in some cases, he might still be inexpensive enough to use as your third forward, at which point he should be giving you really solid value. So while this is the team that I'm choosing, at least as of right now, that's a look at all the other players that I'm keeping an eye on as potential last-minute tweaks or transfer targets. Then just out of curiosity, because we saw so many players at 6.5 million or less who seemed really solid, I threw together a team of only players that cost 6.5 million or less, just to see how good they would be, and it was pretty interesting. Obviously that isn't really a restriction when it comes to the goalie, so you can take whoever you want there, and then likewise in the defense. But then in the midfield, Bailey, Nkunku, Szoboszlai, Rodri, Rice, all solid and a combination of some relatively safe picks and some higher risk ones as well. And then up front, Cunha, João Pedro, and Muniz, all of whom, as I was saying, solid mostly as a third striker in most situations. This is probably the weakest position, but it's still half decent. So I'd be kind of tempted to see how a team like this that has 9 million budget to spare would stack up against everyone else. But obviously, you would only ever do this to mess around. Then, as a quick aside, apparently there's this new fantasy challenge format, which is slightly different because it's only 5 players, and you have no budget, and basically no limit on how many players you can take per team, so you can just pick the best players overall. So, I mean, this is what I threw in. It feels like it's straightforward in this case. I mean, I didn't put in Haaland, I guess is the one obvious player that I left out, but given how Man City is playing Chelsea in week 1, that felt like, maybe it wasn't a sure thing that Haaland was going to score a bunch of goals, so Solanke and Isak both felt like safe alternatives. I don't know that I'm actually going to do this fantasy challenge format long term, or that I'll even remember that it exists, but I was at least a little intrigued. So there's a whole bunch of analysis to prepare you for the start of the EPL fantasy season. Let me know what you think of this type of video. I love talking about this stuff, but it's very different from anything we've done in the past, so if people like it, I could do a weekly update video, but if not, then I'll leave it at just this. But either way, thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Maybe.